Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bombe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 4 baking books, including Snackable Bakes. In each episode, I hang out with some of the sweetest bakers around and take a deep dive into their signature bakes. My guest today is Edd Kimber. Edd is a baker, cookbook author, food journalist, and the very first winner of the Great British Bake Off. Edd was working at a job he hated when he entered and won the beloved baking competition, and as such, pivoted his career to baking. Since then, he's written 8 books, including his latest, Chocolate Baking, the ultimate guide to cakes, cookies, desserts, and pastries. And his editorial work has appeared in publications like The Guardian, BBC Good Food, and more. Edd joins me to talk about when he first began baking. There might have been some mince pies involved. How he heard about the Great British Bake Off in the first place, what it was like winning it, and how it catapulted him into his incredible professional life as a baker and cookbook author. He also tells me about his new book, Chocolate Baking, including the story of its cover, which is pretty unique and great. Then he walks me through the recipe for his Tahini Milk Chocolate Paris-Brest, and we go deep on each component. Edd has great tips for making perfect choux pastry at home, for how to melt chocolate in the microwave, his favorite way to do it, and mine, and why he makes ganache with warm cream and melted chocolate. I know you're going to love my chat with Edd, so stay tuned. You can find today's recipe at cherrybombe.substack.com. A huge thank you to everyone who joined us at Jubilee last weekend in Manhattan. It was an unforgettable day, filled with insightful conversations, incredible food and drink, laughter, and so much joy. I loved meeting so many of you who attended, and I hope you enjoyed the day as much as I did. Want to be the first to know about future Cherry Bombe Jubilees and other fun events? Subscribe to Cherry Bombe's newsletter at cherrybombe.substack.com or click the link in our show notes. Let's chat with today's guest. Edd, so excited to finally have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to chat Paris-Brest with you and so much more.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to be here.
You grew up in a house where there was a lot of baking happening, which interestingly enough is not always the case with guests.
Nope.
At all.
Sometimes the opposite. Yeah.
Right? Can you share sort of your earliest baking memory where you were actually doing the baking?
Yeah. So I said there's a lot of baking, but it was all quite simple things. Not to say my simple baking is a problem, but my household was very much like cook everything from scratch. And so we would always have like a crumble on the weekends. My mum would do a roast and there was an apple crumble. But the first thing I think I remember making, it's definitely one of 2 things. One, either it's mince pies, which is an English classic, and I have a memory of being allowed to spoon in the filling, but my little hands were too hot for pastry, so my mum was like, no, only the filling. It would have been scones as well, because that was a big feature in our childhood.
I also read about, and I think this was an early baking memory of yours, or maybe it was the first dish you ever learned to make, was the crumble, and that you would weigh the ingredients for Sunday lunch.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, crumble was just something we had all the time,
right.
So I was always helping out in the kitchen, and so crumble would have been one of the early things. But I have a real memory of my mum making it because she would have this big plastic mixing bowl that attached to her mixer. And it was such an old mixer. I was actually in a museum the other day and saw the mixer. I was like, oh, don't want to tell my mom that her mixer was in this museum.
Right.
The memory is actually a noise, really. She would stand in the doorway to our living room, and Coronation Street, which is a soap opera, would be on the television, and she'd be like double duty of making dinner whilst trying to watch this thing. And so I would just hear the knife cutting through the butter into this plastic bowl. So it's a very like, if I hear something similar, it reminds me of it.
Yeah.
I realized when we got engaged that I also had another very strong memory, and it was my mum rolling pastry, but you'd hear the clink of her ring on the rolling pin.
Yeah.
And so when we got engaged, and I have a ring, which I have now lost, sadly, I would hear the clink and it would remind me of that as I was a kid. Yeah.
I also just loved this idea, and I don't know how old we can picture, but I'm picturing like a very young Edd using a scale.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the way we bake.
I know, but for us, it's so different.
Well, I remember standing on a stool. That's how young I was. Like, I couldn't reach the counter.
Yeah.
And I definitely would have helped is a generous word
Yeah.
for measuring out things. But yeah, we always bake with scales. There's not even like an area where you go from cups or anything else to scales. It's just that's how we start.
Love.
Because it's more accurate.
Exactly. Which many listeners know, maybe all.
I sense you may have ranted about that before.
What about an early baked good eating memory? Could be something of your mom's, but could also be at a store, wherever.
All those things were things we had a lot. So all of the childhood things that I just talked about, they would have been things that I had from a very young age. I can also remember my 7th birthday cake because my parents did a big party for me and my twin brother, and we had separate cakes, one each, and it was a very simple chocolate cake. It had like Disney decals on it. It had a little plastic train. And I definitely remember it because we were caught hiding underneath the table with a tablecloth so we couldn't be seen eating this chocolate cake. I don't know if it was like we'd snuck a second piece maybe.
Right.
But we knew we weren't supposed to be there. So.
I love that.
But then also one of the other things that really sticks in my head is I have a much older brother and sister, and my sister was living in a different county near the sea, and she would come and see us quite regularly. And every time she came, because she was in a county that was known for this dish, she would always bring it with her because it was my mum's favourite. And it's a thing called an Eccles cake. Mm-hmm. An Eccles cake is not a cake, it's a pastry. So it's like a kind of flaky pastry ball, and inside it is this very, very, very sweet spiced currant mixture. So if you've ever had a Christmas mince pie, it's similar to that, but it's much drier. It's not a wet mixture. And I'm obsessed with them. So my sister would bring them and I would get very excited because it would we never have these here because they're not from the county we're from. It was a very regional thing. And so it was still to this day one of my favorites, but it was always a nice thing when my sister came that she'd bring a box of them.
Your mom was a big baker.
Yes.
Did your dad bake? Did your sister bake? Did Simon bake?
No, my dad does not bake. Not really. He kind of has done some things now that he's kind of at retirement, but he's not a baker. He's a very good cook. But my mum came from a tradition where people just cook and bake and do everything from scratch. So my grandmother, my nana, was a huge baker, and she would always have cake in the house at all times. She would make what is called parkin, which is a very regional type of gingerbread cake. And she'd make it every week. Because this is gingerbread, it would get better over time. The texture would get softer and stickier. The flavor would become more intense. And so by the time that cake was finished, it was time to make the next one. My brother does bake. He's a good baker. He does really enjoy it. And my sister is an amazing baker. She doesn't do it as much now, but we spent a lot of time when we were kids because she was so much older. There's a memory I have where my sister was babysitting us, I think, and my parents went around, and the activity she gave us was to make a chocolate cake. My only memory of that is not making the cake, not eating the cake. It was looking at the bowl, again, under the table. And I don't know what it is, but I seem to be hiding under tables eating chocolate cake a lot. I don't know what that says about me, but that's something that seems to be happening.
That should be the name of your memoir.
Yes, hiding under tables eating chocolate cake. It's got a ring to it.
Would you say that your family, did they recognize in you, Ed, that you had a knack for this or an affinity for baking, and you were different than the other siblings? Would your mom have been like, oh my God, Ed is doing an incredible job?
I don't know. I think probably I was doing it I was in the kitchen more than my brother at the time because I really enjoyed being in the kitchen. But ironically, my brother was the one who, when you're at school, at high school, you do work experience where you go and try a job out for 2 weeks. And my brother was the one who said he wanted to be a pastry chef. Oh. So he went and did work experience in a hotel pastry section.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be a graphic designer. I think the kind of real passion for baking didn't come until university and then post-university. I think when I was a kid, it wasn't even like a hobby. It was just this is what we do. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of enjoyed it. So it wasn't as if I was like, Mum, I want to bake this, I want to bake this. We had someone come to my event today very young kid who loved to bake and was making adventurous things. And we had a kid come to an event in LA who had his own Instagram for baking. It was that was not what I was doing as a kid. Mainly because it didn't exist.
Right.
But also it was just what we did.
Yep.
I didn't even think of it as a career option at the time. It was just, it's kind of nice to make a cake,
But it sounds like your parents, I know your brother is a ceramicist or has started a ceramics business. It seems like on some level, somehow, whether they were fostering it or not, there was an environment in which being a creative person was applauded and encouraged.
Well, both my parents are antique dealers, and my dad he's retired from this part of the business. He was a leading antiques restorer in the UK, and he was so talented. And he also loves to paint. And so me and my dad used to go to art galleries when we were kids. Art especially was something really big in our family, but also valuing craft was a really big thing. So we didn't have a lot of money, but my parents really loved things like really good quality wine or travel. So we were exposed to a lot of amazing things as kids, and kind of respecting and understanding cooking was a big part of it. And so my parents would always take an opportunity to have us in the kitchen, show us how something was made. It was never something that was like separated out from us. And so I definitely think they encouraged us to do something that we loved. I think my mum, when I first started doing this, probably hoped I would have a very stable job that paid lots more money for her own, like, you know,
peace of mind.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I was like, I'm going to move to London and I have no money.
Yeah.
I have no job. I have no prospects. I'm going to go and do this baking thing. So yeah.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. If you love our show, did you know that we publish a free baking newsletter every Saturday to correspond with each new episode? Check out Cherry Bomb's Substack to subscribe to our She's My Cherry Pie newsletter today, where you'll get exclusive insights about my guests on the show, their recipes, and other fun baking news and tips. Plus, check out our other free newsletters where you'll find the latest food and fashion news and browse through our recipe catalog, which is filled with some really great recipes. While you're there, consider becoming a paid Substack subscriber to get access to exclusive content from Cherry Bombe Magazine, invites to our monthly Bombe Squad meetings with industry pros, and discounts to events like our annual Jubilee Conference. A subscription is just $6 per month, or $55 a year. Learn more at cherrybomb.substack.com or click the link in our show notes. Now back to our guest. All right, now we're going to segue into Great British Bake Off.
What? Who?
Yeah. What? Ed, no. So you won in 2010. It was the first season. You were only 24 years old. And I learned actually that it never aired in the U.S.
So it did. It's confusing. A lot of people think it didn't, but it was a very odd situation.
Okay.
So it aired briefly on PBS, but then it disappeared for years. But it has just weirdly come back. So you can now watch all of the back catalog on Roku TV.
Yeah, because everybody's going to want to do this.
Oh, I mean,
after
please be
kind.
kind. It was a long time ago. My baking has improved a lot since then.
Well, so you were only 24 years old. You were working. You were a baby. You were working at a job post-university that you hated. I read you worked at a bank in the litigation department.
I was a glorified debt collector.
Yeah. And you've said it was really stressful because you hated it and you turned to baking for stress release. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's kind of when I took a turn with baking, because I was in this job that I fell into as a temp because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a journalist, but I couldn't afford to do a free internship for 6 months. I then thought, I have a degree in international relations. I'll go work for a humanitarian charity. Couldn't work for free for 6 months. And so I didn't know what to do with myself, and then took a temp job in a bank, and I was chasing people for debts, and I hated it. I was really bad at it. Sometimes when I tell people that I was a debt collector, they look me up and down and go, you. I'm like, not in person. Can you imagine me knocking on a door going, hello, can I have my money, please?
Yeah.
I hated it. People would swear at me all day. I had death threats on the phone, multiple occasions. My way of coping was to spend my day planning recipes that I would make in the evening, and I would bring them in for staff the next day to kind of make them happier. It was in that period where I just realized I need to do something that I really enjoy. And at the time, I joked that the only thing I was good at was baking. Because my parents are self-employed, I kind of always assumed I would run a business or do something on my own. So I applied to catering college. I got turned down.
We have to talk about that.
I don't know
How
why.
is that possible?
I say it in every interview because I'm like secretly hoping the admissions department.
college,
like, oh, damn. But it was that point I became quite pig-headed about it and decided I'm going to teach myself. I'm going to give myself an education.
Incredible.
I'd been doing that for a couple of years of like obsessively trying to bake something new, learn a new technique, learn a new flavor profile, try something different. That someone sent me the application for Bake Off and said, I think you should do this.
I'm assuming no YouTube back then.
No.
So where were you looking? Were you looking to cookbooks?
Books. Yeah, I bought hundreds and hundreds of books over those years. If it was about baking and I'd seen it, I would buy it. Yep. So I bought loads of big, meaty, like textbooks that were so dry. And then I would buy like consumer cookbooks just so I could read about something different, try something different. and just kind of fill my brain with baking knowledge.
Yeah. And then were you taking copious notes? Like, did you?
Kind of. I had this really bad blog that I was kind of teaching myself and like writing about what I'd learn. And it was because of that someone read the blog.
That's what I read. Yeah. I love that.
I can't find the email. It's really annoying. I once tried to find it so I could send the person like a thank you.
Oh my God.
But cannot find the email to save my life.
Well, I also love it. I think you said you had no idea anyone was even reading your book.
I think my mum read it and that was about it.
Yeah. And then like this other random person who said you should. I love that. I love that. And you say that you only ever applied because you never thought you would get on.
I was, shockingly now, considering my effervescent self, a very shy person.
Yeah.
The idea of putting myself out in front of TV to be critiqued was a nightmare.
Yeah.
I also hated reality TV. The reality TV of the time was things like X Factor was just starting, and a lot of those shows to me were about laughing at people rather than uplifting and celebrating people. And I was very nervous that I would go on the show and become like somehow a laughingstock in the media. Didn't want that. 2 friends of mine had to convince me to do the show.
Yeah.
They convinced me that at least it would be interesting to kind of see how a show is put together because I wouldn't get on. So why not go and see an audition kind of thing? I was shocked at every stage that I kept getting through each stage. But there was a very odd kind of light bulb moment when I realized what TV was like. And it was my very first in-person audition because I had recently lost about 140 pounds at the time. And I was also, this is when I was learning to bake and all of those things. I remember going into this interview and they were actually auditioning the judges at this point too. So the judge was Mary, but someone else who wasn't Paul.
And just a quick aside, you've said you didn't even know who Mary was.
No, not a clue. No.
We're talking about Mary Berry, peeps.
Yes, but remember, at the time, Mary hadn't done a TV show in like 20 years. She had a big gap.
Yeah.
And my generation had skipped her.
But
I was the only person on the show who didn't know who she was. I felt very embarrassed. I did go and buy a book of hers. Everyone else is bringing out old, battered copies to get her to sign and like take off the wrapper from the book. So I'm like, oh, hey, Mary, here's all these recipes I've made. So I was in the audition room and they were chatting away. They were very nice. Mary said very nice things. She was like, this is the best Bakewell tart she's ever had or something. And everything was going very well. But there was this chef who's a guy called Galton Blackerstone. I'm assuming it's timeless past. I can say his name. He was a very nice guy, and he just said a throwaway line because I was so unbelievably skinny at the time, probably unhealthily so. He said, oh, you don't look like you bake all the time. And I just innocently, without even thinking about it, just said, oh, well, I did just lose like 10 stone, 140 pounds. And I actually baked as I did that. And I'd forgotten there was a camera behind me actually filming the judges because they were auditioning them. And this camera flew in front of my face and was like, tell me about this. And I could see the producer's like brain whirring, going, oh, that's a story we can hang something on. And so I very quickly realized that TV is TV and not as easy and simple as it seems. There's a lot of story editing in there.
Yeah.
They never actually used those stories on the show in the end. They said early on to keep it more about the food, but the producer was definitely going, we can use this for sure.
Yeah. Ed was the first. I love it. All right, so we're going to jump to books.
Yes.
You are so prolific. This is your 8th book, correct?
This is my 8th book.
And how did that first book come about? I understand the show opens many, many doors.
Less than, though. It was a much different situation.
More so than you think?
There was definitely like a golden point for the doors it would open up from the show.
Yeah.
Season 1 was not that case. It opened lots of doors, and I'm extremely thankful.
Yeah.
But it was so fascinating to watch contestants go on the show and see what was thrown at them because the show became even more successful.
Right, of course.
But I'm actually eternally grateful that I only did the first season because I would not have enjoyed the level of scrutiny and attention some of those seasons got because it was uncomfortable to me. I was mainly offered things like, come and work in our kitchen. We've got a job for you as a baker.
Oh,
that sort of thing. And I was doing bits of TV after the show as well. But I really wanted to get experience in the kitchen, so I went and worked in Michelin star kitchens and different bakeries. But the one that really sticks with me was a restaurant called Le Manoir, which is a 2-star, maybe it's 3-star now actually, restaurant in Oxford. Beautiful restaurant run by Raymond Blanc, who's maybe one of the most famous chefs in the UK. It was an amazing experience and I loved my time, but I immediately knew I didn't want to work in kitchens anymore.
Yeah.
And it was partly down to the way my brain works in terms of like creativity. I love making something from start to finish. I love thinking about what it's going to be and then making it and seeing that finished thing. And in a kitchen, you're not doing that. Unless you are the head chef, the highest of the high, you are making elements and someone else is dealing with it. So I was segmenting oranges for days on end. I was making ganaches, and it was like great, but also really boring to me. I wasn't fulfilling what I wanted a pastry job to fulfill. And I think that's also because the restaurant was so big. They had a big team. And so I decided to move to London because I was getting lots of opportunities at the time. Within a couple of weeks of being there, an editor reached out and said, do you want to write a recipe for a magazine? And I was like, oh yeah, that'd be fun. I'll do that. And I was extremely grateful because it very quickly was like, this is the thing I should be doing. It fulfilled every part of my creativity that I was trying to find a home for. And I just loved the process. I liked working on my own, and then I liked working with the team. It was like kind of every part of my personality. And so from there, I realized, okay, this is what I think I could do. And my agent at the time was like, let's try and sell a book. And very luckily, within about a week, we had offers on the table. And then I've just not stopped.
Yeah.
I don't have a life. I just stay at home and bake all day.
And right. Have you been with the same team this whole time?
No, I have just moved. So my most recent book, Chocolate Baking, is a new team. And I think it was the right time to make a move. And I think it has been the most satisfying move. This book is, I know it's very gauche to say it yourself, but I think it's the best thing I've ever done. And I have just loved this process. So.
It definitely has a different, I don't have all of your books, but I have a bunch of them, and it has a very different feel.
Yeah. In my head, I really was trying to prove something probably just to myself. So I wanted to write something meatier and something that had kind of more gravitas to it. I wanted to write something that could hopefully outlast me. I know that sounds super big-headed, but that's kind of what I was trying to write the book as I went in. I wanted to write something that felt like the chocolate book I would have wanted to buy. And hopefully I've done 50% of that, maybe.
You have. Your new book is Chocolate Baking,
Yes.
The Ultimate Guide to Cakes, Cookies, Desserts, and Pastries. And you say it's a love letter to your favorite ingredient.
100%.
I thought this was interesting. You dreamed of doing this book for years, and publishers said it was too niche. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we had some really interesting conversations over the years. I pitched this book to basically everybody in town, and everybody turned it down. It's about 6 years ago, I think. At the same time, someone told me in a pitch meeting that, quote, baking is over, baking is a trend. And I was just like, oh, okay. Don't think that's quite right. But they had seen baking in the UK, especially, as purely something people were doing because they were enjoying Bake Off. And 6 years ago, Bake Off started to take a tick down in its viewing figures. And so they decided that baking was a trend. And I was just like, this is clearly nonsense. So the book kind of then lodged itself at the back of my head, waiting for a chance. And when I decided I wanted to make a break with my publisher, I thought this is the time to kind of repitch this and see what people think. And thankfully, the reception from publishers was amazing. And I was like, okay, maybe this is the right time then.
I love that you write it's in sort of describing what to expect from the recipes. You know, sometimes the chocolate is front and center.
Yep.
Sometimes it plays a supporting role. How did you determine, like, did you feel like 2/3 of my book has to be chocolate center, but I can put in a third?
No, so there was no specific number, but what I wanted to do with the book, I was very clear with this from the get-go that the book should not just be dark chocolate. Because I think so many people, when I talked to them about the book in the early days, assumed it would be like a chocolate cake, a cookie, a brownie. And like that flavor profile would be the dominant flavor throughout. And I just thought chocolate is way more than that. And I really wanted to show the incredible breadth of flavor of chocolate itself, but also how chocolate can be used to pair with other things. And so as I was developing the recipes and working on it, I just realized that actually sometimes the chocolate in this recipe isn't the first thing you're tasting or even the second thing you're tasting. And so I wanted to kind of play into that a little bit. And so I wanted to show that it can be more than just the hero. And I think it's led to some very interesting recipes. But chocolate is still obviously the main flavor throughout the book, but there's variation in there to make it interesting as well, because I think if it was just all dark chocolate recipes, that might not be the most interesting book. So I do joke that the only chocolate that's not in the book is ruby chocolate because I hate it.
What's that?
It's a chocolate made by one company, and it's kind of like a variation of white chocolate, but they're very vague about how it's made, and I just don't think it tastes very nice.
Yeah.
So I don't class it as one of the subtypes of chocolate. So we just pretend it doesn't exist.
All right. So now we're going to talk about your recipe for Tahini Milk Chocolate Paris-Brest. First of all, tell us about Paris-Brest for those that don't know what it is.
So Paris-Brest is a ring-shaped pastry that was named for a bike race that went from Paris to Brest. The story goes that there's a pastry shop along the route and he wanted to make something to honor the race. It's kind of like cash in on it, I guess. Originally, it's a choux ring, and then it's filled with normally a hazelnut creme mousseline, which is basically a custard-based buttercream. And then it has praline in it. And it's really delicious. It's nutty. It's creamy. It's incredibly extravagant looking. And it is one of my all-time favorite French baking recipes. And to be honest, patisserie is part of the reason I bake for a living, because I'm obsessed with French baking. I had such a nice reaction when people have made it because it feels very familiar at the same time as being quite adventurous and different tasting.
And is the shape of the Paris-Brest like a wheel of a bicycle?
Exactly. Okay. It's meant to be the wheel of a bicycle. Yeah, exactly. No spokes, but just the wheel. Yeah.
You also have this additional texture because of the sesame crackling. Yeah.
So normally it wouldn't have a crackling on it at all. It would just be choux pastry. And then you would cover the choux when it's raw with flaked almonds normally. And so it would have some sort of coating. But obviously crackling has become this big thing that people use in choux. And I like it not necessarily just for its texture, but I like it because it gives home bakers an added thing in their arsenal. Because when you add a layer of crackling, which is basically just a crumble mixture, like a streusel mixture, rolled into sheets, if you add that to a choux bun, it allows the choux to rise to its fullest potential.
I was going to ask you about that. How?
When you put choux in the oven, it forms a crust very quickly. And it means that's why you get that kind of cauliflower-looking texture. It can be very uneven, not very round. Bakers have often tried to find ways to help it open up as much as it can. So using steam potentially, or adding an egg wash, something to stop it setting too quickly. And so crackling, because it's like a pastry dough or like a sablé kind of dough, it sets less quickly than choux does in the oven. So if you put it on top of the choux, it melts on top of it and it allows the choux to rise before it has a chance to set. And so if you make a choux bun from the same dough, one without crackling, one with crackling, the one with crackling will be much bigger and much more open because it's been given that time to open more. But it also then adds a delicious, nice, thin, crisp texture. But for home bakers, the reason I like it is because I always say that choux is such an easy thing to make, but it's harder to perfect than some pastries. And I find a lot of people often get the amount of egg a little bit wrong, and adding the crackling kind of helps ensure that it will open up, even
regardless
if you've added not enough.
All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll make the sesame crackling. So we'll put some all-purpose flour, some superfine sugar, which is castor sugar. In the UK, is there ever a sugar that has as large granules as our granulated?
Yeah, so our granulated has bigger granules than your granulated.
Okay.
So actually, most of the time, if you're following a recipe that says castor sugar, it's a UK recipe, you can use granulated sugar here, no problem. But the closest is superfine.
Okay.
But American granulated is less than our granulated. But most people don't bake with our granulated, so they use it for tea and coffee.
So we'll put the all-purpose flour, the castor sugar, some black and white sesame seeds, fine sea salt in a bowl, and combine. Are we whisking at this stage?
You're rubbing together, so it's like making a crumble crisp topping.
But before we add the butter...
you give it a whisk to make sure everything's distributed.
Okay. And then we're going to add some diced unsalted butter. Is it room temperature or is it cold?
You can do either, really. If it's room temperature, it's easier to work with, but it can get a little bit greasy, so I like to have it a little bit chilled.
So we'll add this diced unsalted butter somewhere sort of between room temp and cold. We'll rub it together with the dry ingredients. Are we rubbing with our fingers?
So in the UK, we do not have pastry cutters. We don't use them. You are free to use a pastry cutter. And to be honest, for some people, it's easier to start with a pastry cutter and then finish with your hands. But you want it very, very fine. So for me, a pastry cutter is really good to start with, but I don't like getting it really fine with them because it takes forever for me. So I much prefer getting my hands in. And if you don't even want to do that, you can just throw the whole thing in a food processor and blitz it up until it comes together.
We'll rub it together until the crumbly dough forms. Then we'll gently press that together. Is that sort of like, are we kneading it at this?
Not really. It has enough fat that it will hold together, but you're trying to make sure that it's compressed. So a little bit of kind of gentle kneading. You just want to make sure it's a ball of dough.
Yep.
So it's kind of like any crumble mixture. It'll be really crumbly when you finish, but as soon as you press it together, it should start to hold together.
So we'll sort of knead it or press it together to form a uniform dough with no butter lumps. We'll place the dough between 2 sheets of parchment paper, roll into an 1/8 inch thick, and then we'll freeze that. And I assume you just throw in the 2. You probably don't even need to put it on a sheet tray, or do you put it on a sheet tray?
You should put it on a sheet tray only because the dough is incredibly thin by the time you finish, and it will conform to whatever it's sat on. So if you have a tray that will fit into, that would be best.
Perfect.
Generally, the rule is you can't really roll it out thin enough. It can be too thick, but there's no such thing as too thin when it comes to crackling. And actually, the great thing about the sesame seeds is it prevents you rolling it out too thin because it kind of holds its shape.
Yeah. And you give us this little warning, once we're ready to use it, we're going to use it straight out of the freezer because it warms up really quickly.
Yeah, because you're going to cut a big ring from it. If the dough warms up too much, it'll be quite hard to maneuver.
Yeah. So now we're going to make the choux. I think listeners know this, but name some of the other things that we make with choux besides Paris-Brest.
Oh, so you can make French crullers, which are my favorite. You can make eclairs, obviously. You can make religious, which is another favorite. You never see it on sale anywhere, but it's 2 choux buns stacked on top of each other, and they look very fancy. It's part of a gâteau Saint-Honoré. The outside edge is made with choux. You can also make gougère if you want to make a savory.
Croquembouche too.
Croquembouche is like the giant version of many choux buns, which is the classic French wedding cake as well.
And profiteroles.
Of course.
Yum. So we are going to sift together some all-purpose flour onto a sheet of parchment, or we can do it into a small bowl. Why do we sift? I don't think.
So you don't have to sift, but the key is when you add the flour to the dough, you need to combine it very quickly. And it can form lumps. So I sift as little as possible. I think most of the time it's pointless. But when I'm trying to avoid lumps in a mixture where it can form, then I will do it. So generally I sift for choux pastry.
So we're going to put some water and some whole milk, some fine sea salt, superfine sugar or the castor sugar, and butter in a saucepan. Yep. Place over low heat until the butter melts, and then we'll increase the heat and bring it to a boil. I have started when I'm making choux. I don't even know if they have this in England, but I have been using skim milk or non-fat milk, which is the same really as using whole milk and water. Yeah,
so traditionally some recipes use all water, some recipes use all milk for different reasons. Recipes made with all milk tend to brown less because there's no milk protein. It also tends to have a slightly less luxurious taste. And then some recipes will use all milk for the opposite reason. So I kind of opted for a half and half kind of situation.
I've also read, I think this is true, that less fat, so either the skim milk or the water plus the whole milk helps the choux pastry rise or helps it form its crispier exterior.
Yeah, technically water causes evaporation. So theoretically, if you're using all milk, there's slightly less water available for it. I think it's probably very minimal, is my guess, because obviously milk is still almost all water. But my guess is that's why you're hearing that for sure.
Now we're going to add flour to this rolling, boiling mixture all at once. Stir vigorously. Spatula?
I normally use a spatula. Yeah, you can use a wooden spoon, but something sturdy, not something flimsy.
Yep. We've increased the heat to bring it to a boil. Are we keeping it at that high heat as we add the flour?
So you add the flour and basically you're making what's called the panade, which is the dough without eggs. If you're using a non-stick pan, ignore this, but if you're using a regular like stainless steel pot, you mix it until it kind of forms a skin on the bottom. The skin doesn't technically mean anything, but it's an indicator it's at the right temperature because what you're trying to do is get the flour to gelatinize, and that is the first stage of cooking. And to be honest, it doesn't need very long for it to do that, but that skin on the bottom of the pan is a definite indicator it's got to the right temperature.
Then we're going to transfer the dough into a bowl, and we're going to beat. At this point, we're beating by hand, correct? Or
you can do it either way. I tend to do this amount of choux by hand, but if you're making more, or even if you're making this, you can use a mixer. It's no problem.
Yep. And again, are you using spatula, wooden spoon?
For this, I tend to use something probably sturdy, so it would be maybe a wooden spoon. But just because you're going to beat quite a lot, anything too floppy is just not going to work.
You're going to sort of just be beating by hand with your wooden spoon for a few minutes. You're trying to cool down. Is it panade?
The panade. You'll see as soon as you start to mix it, that steam comes off of it. And you just want to cool it down ever so slightly. It's not a huge amount, but it's just enough that the eggs won't immediately start cooking.
Now we're going to add some lightly beaten eggs, a little at a time, beating until just combined before adding more. Basically, we're beating until we see a smooth, a little bit glossy dough. And I love this. When you lift the spatula from the bowl or the wooden spoon, the dough will form a V.
Like a V-shaped ribbon. Yeah, so that the reason you don't add all the eggs at once is A, it kind of splits when you add the egg. But the other reason is so that you can get the right texture, because choux is one of those places where it has quite a lot of variables depending on how long you cook it for. If you've slightly overmeasured the water or whether you're using a different brand of flour, will all absorb different amounts of egg. And so the egg content of a choux recipe should always be kind of viewed as a guide. Unless you're making that recipe over and over again with the same ingredients, you'll get very used to it. But most of the time, it's worth adding it slowly so you can keep checking it. But it needs to hold itself but still have a little gloss. If it's not shiny, it will go very dry and biscuity, and it won't open up very much. But if it's super wet and very, very glossy, then it will rise and then collapse because there's too much egg in the batter.
You have a great picture of the dough hanging off of the tool, so you can see that V.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's really important to give visual clues because it's sometimes very hard to convey what you mean in words. And so I do try and put in as many of those pictures as we can, definitely.
So we're going to heat the oven to 375 degrees. We're going to line a baking sheet with parchment. Before we line, we will take that piece of parchment, and on the back of that paper, we'll draw an 8-inch circle. Then we're going to scrape the choux pastry into a piping bag. Are you using plastic piping bags, fabric ones?
Plastic. Only because the worst thing to wash in my mind is a fabric bag. If you want to use them, more speed. Yeah, I find them quite frustrating to use. So,
And they get moldy. It's so hard to clean them.
I know.
Anyway, so we're going to scrape the choux into a plastic piping bag fitted with a small half-inch round piping tip. And you say if for some reason you're having trouble with the piping, you could try chilling the pastry for a bit.
Yeah, it slightly thickens the mixture up and makes it slightly firmer, so it's slower to pipe. So it's much easier to control. It doesn't affect its baking. It just is a little easier to control. So some places actually do it as a matter of course when they're making choux recipes, but most people at home have never tried it, but it will make it slightly easier.
Yep. Now we're going to pipe 2 rings of pastry, one just inside the circle of the template that we drew and one outside. We're going to ensure that they are touching all the way around. I wondered if this was like a little bit of an Edd flourish, because I have seen other recipes where it's one circle and then just put the other one on the inside.
Yeah, I guess it's just because it was trying to fit the recipe into bakeware that you can get in the UK, because it is a bit tricky when you're writing recipes for people in different countries. Because American ovens, like someone said to me, oh, I'm really sorry, the oven you're going to use today is really small. I'm like, that's a standard British oven. And so it had to fit onto like a half sheet tray, which is absolutely the biggest that could fit in a UK oven. Even some UK ovens that wouldn't fit, mainly just because that would be the right size. Or if I did them both on the outside, it wouldn't quite work.
So then we're going to pipe a third ring on top of the first 2. Remove the cracklin from the freezer quickly. Cut out a ring the same size as the choux. Techniques for that?
It is. I will be honest, that is a little tricky because no one has cookie cutters quite that big. So I often use a plate, put the plate on top, and then either I will have a smaller plate or I freeform the line. Because the exact shape of the cracklin doesn't matter too much. It doesn't have to be perfect. But as long as like the outside edge is better, that's normally fine. But yeah, it can be a little tricky. Often what I do is I cut the ring out before I make the choux and then put it back in the freezer so that I can then just pick it up, put it straight on it. It makes
and it'll already be chilled.
Yeah.
So we'll place our cracklin ring atop our choux. We'll bake for about 35 to 40 minutes until golden brown. I thought this was interesting. So we briefly open the door when the baking is done to allow steam to escape before we're going to close it again, like almost like you would with meringue. Is that an Edd thing?
I don't know if it's specific to me, but it's definitely something I've done for years because the meringue comparison is actually apt because what you're trying to do is stop any steam getting back into it. And the whole way that you dry out choux is often what you would do is take it out very quickly, poke a hole in it, and then put it into a warm space, or even just leave it at room temperature and it dries out naturally because the steam will escape. But with something that big, it's a little hard to handle. So I just got into the habit years ago of drying out the choux slowly. So open the door, let the steam out, and then close it with the oven off. And that heat will cool down and eventually the choux will just get nice and dry. And it means that if you're adding a particularly wet filling, it will just hold its shape a bit better.
About how long are we opening up our oven? Or probably is it oven dependent? 10 seconds.
You know, you're just allowing enough time that you'll see the steam come out as well. And then just, you can close the door. I've seen recipes in the past from French chefs where they would stick a wooden spoon between the door and the actual
to
oven.
Hold it ajar.
Yeah, so let heat escape. But modern ovens, when you turn them off, they tend to dispel the heat quite quickly.
Yeah. So we'll turn off the oven. We'll allow the choux to cool down slowly in the oven about 30 minutes. Would you do the same thing if you were making gougere or profiteroles or eclair?
Depends on the texture you want. So gougères probably no, because I think you need a little moistness in the middle of a gougere. With other ones, like eclairs, definitely I do that. And I would for profiteroles if I wasn't serving them the same day. If I was serving them the same day, maybe not. But if you're using the choux at a later date, the drier the choux, the better. And if you're using a very wet filling, the drier the choux, the better. So you can go too far and it can be crisp and dry and unyieldy, but generally a little bit of drying helps.
Now we're going to make the tahini creme mousseline, which also I learned also can be called German buttercream.
Yeah, kind of. It's basically the same thing. I think technically German buttercream has a slightly different ratio, but it's basically the same thing.
It's like pastry cream.
And butter.
Ton of butter. That you add a ton of butter to.
Yes, exactly.
So the first thing we're going to do is infuse some milk with vanilla flavor. So we're going to pour some whole milk in a large saucepan, cut a vanilla pod to open up along the length, scrape out the seeds. Brand of vanilla that you love?
I'm a big Hey La La fan.
Yeah.
I really like their mission. It's kind of a charity-based company, but they also just make incredible vanilla, so big fan.
Then we're going to add both seeds and the pod itself to the milk, place over medium heat, bring to a simmer, remove from the heat, cover for about 30 to 60 minutes to infuse. Have you ever tried a cold infusion?
Yeah, cold infusion is great for a lot of things.
I love those.
When you add heat to things, it will knock out a certain level of flavor profile. Whereas if you cold infuse, nothing gets left. You do just have to leave it significantly
like
longer.
Overnight, really, I think is what I've done.
Yeah. I think vanilla's quite a hardy flavor, so I don't think it necessarily... It would be great as a cold infusion, but I don't think it's one of those flavors where actually it's much, much better.
Yep.
I think the more delicate and light the flavor of something is, the better a cold infusion is because the heat won't destroy it. So... Tea is often very good done as a cold infusion because it's a little bit more delicate. Yeah, exactly. That floral things work really well.
Once the milk is infused, we'll place the pan back on the heat. We'll add some caster sugar, bring to a simmer. And then in a separate bowl, a large bowl, we'll put some light brown sugar, some egg yolks, some cornstarch, whisk it together until smooth. Why both types of sugar? Why caster and light brown?
The reason is mainly because it's about balance of flavor. So I think a lot about how a flavor will come through in a finished dish, and most pastry creams you'll ever make will have just all white sugar, and it adds no flavor because it has no flavor. I wanted to add a slightly more rounded caramelized flavor, and the tahini obviously has the roasted nutty flavor, and the brown sugar would add a little bit more of a caramel note. But the first time I tested it, I did all brown sugar, and I thought that flavor was too dominant. And so I pulled back and did half and half to kind of give enough edge to the tahini, but not hide the tahini, because obviously it's about celebrating tahini. And so I do that often, is like try and play around with how the balance of something will affect other flavors in a dish.
So now we're going to pour the hot milk over the cornstarch mixture, whisking as we pour to prevent the yolks from scrambling. We'll remove the vanilla pod, pour the custard back into the pan, and then, so basically we tempered the eggs.
Yeah, you're basically making a classic creme pat at this stage.
We're going to pour the custard back into the pan, whisking constantly until the mixture thickens and is bubbly. What temp are we at this point?
So it's really interesting. I don't give a temp because I don't think it's important. And I don't think home bakers need to get kind of het up on things that don't matter. I had someone not very happy with me the other day because they said the recipe didn't have a temperature and they said it was unusable. But I give so many pieces of advice about how something should look, and I think that's actually way more of an indicator. And also, not everyone has the money to buy a really expensive probe thermometer. It's all about look for me. What should happen is, as you're whisking it, the mixture will start to look like it's curdling, but that's just it's thickening. And as long as you're whisking it constantly, it will get to the right stage. And what happens is it will all look very thick. It will almost look slightly gluey. And then to ensure that the starch from the cornstarch is cooked out and you don't taste it, you cook it for another minute.
Boil it.
I think those things are much more important and valuable.
And what about the temp on the flame?
On the flame, you're going to have it about medium high.
Yeah. As you said, we're going to cook another minute. Once it's boiling, to activate the cornstarch as our thickener, scrape into a bowl. We'll whisk in some tahini. We'll cover, set aside for about an hour to cool to room temp.
Yep.
Then we're going to add some room temp unsalted butter to the bowl of a stand mixer with the paddle. Beat for 5 minutes until light and creamy. Add our room temp tahini custard. And you say that both the custard and the butter have to be the same temperature, or the mousseline is going to split.
Yeah, mousseline's one of those things where it has a tendency to want to split because you're trying to add a lot of butter to something. I used to make it years and years ago. I would make a mousseline I'd make the custard, I'd make add the flavoring or whatever, and I put it in the fridge. And then the next day I would make the mousseline. And I was finding it would just split too often. And it was purely because I was taking a cold mixture and trying to add it to a beaten butter mixture. And so this one, there is no resting. You make it, you let it chill, and then you use it. You can put it in the fridge. But if you put it in the fridge, you really have to ensure it's not just like, oh, I've let it come to room temperature for an hour. It needs a long time to make sure that it isn't going to split, and temperature is key for that.
As we're adding the room temp custard, we're just going to add a little bit at a time.
Yep.
They'll be the same temperature, beating until fully combined before we add more. And then once all of the tahini custard is added, we'll switch to the whisk attachment on our stand mixer and mix for about 5 minutes
just
until
to
light
kind
and
of
fluffy.
aerate it a little bit more, yeah. And you should find by the time you've added all of the custard, the mixture should form a kind of buttercream-like texture. It's kind of like making a Swiss meringue where with a Swiss meringue you add the butter slowly to the meringue, and in this case you're adding the custard slowly to the butter. But it's just to make sure everything's properly emulsified and holds its texture properly.
Yeah. Now we are going to make the chocolate component in this recipe. We're going to make a milk chocolate filling.
Yep.
So we're going to put milk chocolate in a small bowl and we'll melt it. We can use either a bain-marie or a microwave. I love that you say the microwave is your favorite because I am very microwave forward.
You just got to be careful because you can very easily
Tell us
burn chocolate.
Tell us your melting chocolate microwave technique.
Never more than 30 seconds. That's the most important thing. Even if you do it on full temperature, never more than 30 seconds because it will burn so quickly. So short bursts, stir every time, basically.
Yep. Now we're going to pour some heavy cream into a small saucepan and bring to a simmer. I thought it was kind of unusual. I think of this as a ganache. I thought it was kind of unusual to melt the chocolate and warm the cream because often we're pouring warm cream over this room temperature chocolate.
So all the ganache in the book uses that technique.
Yeah.
And it's because when I asked kind of my audience and readers what they struggled with ganache, splitting was the biggest thing. There's two changes. One of them that you as an American probably would never notice, but one of them is the type of cream that I use. So in the UK, we have this cream called double cream, which is about 45 to 50% fat, which is much higher than heavy cream here. And I find that one of the main reasons ganache is split for people at home is they're using too much fat, and it causes the ganache to be an unstable emulsion. The other thing they do is improper technique, and what they do is they boil the dairy really hard and they pour it over room temperature chocolate. And the problem with that is you've got a massive temperature differential. And so like we talked about with the butter and the custard earlier, when things are at a closer temperature, they tend to combine better. And so this was a technique I got taught when I was in kitchens straight after bake-off. What you do is you bring the cream just to a simmer, you melt the chocolate, they're at much closer temperatures. And then you very slowly incorporate the cream in 3 additions, and it just ensures that the emulsion is really tight and very, very secure. Much less likely to split, it will hold itself better. So it's just a nice technique to get your kind of using regularly because it just makes a better quality ganache that is much less likely to split. So I use it all the way through the book.
And so different than usually when you pour the warm cream over the room temp chocolate, you wait a minute and you start stirring just from the center.
Exactly.
It sort of takes out all that fussiness.
Well, also the reason for leaving that ganache for a couple of minutes in that way is the same reason. It's to try and bring the temperature of the cream down and the chocolate up. And by pouring that hot cream over the chocolate, it raises the chocolate temperature and the cream will start to cool down. So I just find it works much more frequently if you do this method. But if you prefer the other method, it will also work that way.
So we poured the heavy cream into a saucepan, bring to a simmer. We're going to pour a third of it over the chocolate. We'll stir to combine, adding the remaining cream and 2 additions, stirring well until we have a smooth, silky ganache. We'll leave it at room temp until it's pipeable. Finally, assembly. We're going to scrape the 2 fillings into 2 separate piping bags. The mousseline will have a 1-inch star tip, and then just a small round tip for the ganache. We'll use a serrated knife to slice the choux in half horizontally. Is that tricky? Or at this point, is it relatively sturdy?
It's sturdy enough, but I also wouldn't concentrate too hard on it being perfect. Because, yes, ideally, you'd get it completely level all the way through. But I also realize that, that's not necessarily going to happen, so it's fine. Once you cover it and dust it with icing sugar, you'll never know the difference. It's fine.
So now we're going to pipe most of the chocolate filling into the base. So I wondered, it's like a chocolate surprise with this dish?
Yeah, kind
because
of. You wouldn't see it.
It's hidden in the kind of cavity of the bottom layer.
100%. Yeah. There's a little bit on the decoration at the end, but it wouldn't look that impactful.
Yeah.
But it is nice to cut in and see those 2 layers.
So we pipe most of the filling into the base. We won't really see it poke out. Then we'll pipe all the mousseline on top in whatever style you prefer. I noticed, I think in the picture, I don't know what you would call that.
It's kind of like a rope, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how I think of it.
Yeah.
To be honest, there's so many different ways of doing it, and none of them are that straightforward. So I think I said do it whichever way you want because I didn't want to be prescriptive because I know piping is one thing that people find very difficult. So just get it in there, basically.
Place the other half of the choux back on top of the filling. We'll dust with powdered sugar, and then we'll pipe the remaining chocolate on top of the choux, sprinkle with a few extra sesame seeds, and serve. I noticed in the photograph in the book, you're sort of mid-piping of the chocolate, so we don't get to see. What design do you like with the chocolate on top?
Basically a very thin ring of chocolate. You may have enough to do like 2 circles around it. And then, I kind of scatter just a few sesame seeds onto the chocolate because they just stick on it. And it's just added interest. You can completely leave it off if you'd rather. You can put all the chocolate inside it. It's just to make it have a little bit of an extra visual pop. I remember Mary Berry once told me years ago that you should only ever garnish with things that are in the dish. So, like, you should never put, like, a sprig of mint on something that has no mint in it. And so I've always just kind of had that in the head, like, oh, I'm going to add a garnish. Okay, let's put chocolate because I want to indicate there's chocolate inside.
Yeah.
And I don't always do that, but for some reason, when I was thinking about this recipe, that popped into my head.
Yeah, well, it makes sense to me that since it's a bit of a surprise because you can't really tell.
Yeah, exactly.
It's nice to be able to,
like
to foreshadow it on the top.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Ed. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
You're mine. Thank you, Jessie.
That's it for today's show. Don't forget to follow She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And tell your pals about us. You can find today's recipe at cherrybomb.substack.com. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Jenna Sadu. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!